Well, sorry about that delay. And I've got my notes back. I've got Zoom working. And so it's good to be with you for our Tuesday night Bible study. We are in Ezekiel chapter 21, which I've entitled Hope in the Midst of Judgment. Well, I don't know about you, if you've read Ezekiel chapter 21, you almost want to close the chapter and move on swiftly, because it gives us a graphic portrayal of the wrath and the fury of God and the judgment of God. But tucked away inside this chapter is a promise of great hope, although I'm not sure that the hearers of Ezekiel's message noticed it, understood it, or were able to put their hope in it. The chapter will announce the end of the monarchy in Judah, and the promise is that God will give his throne to the one who comes in fulfilment of the messianic prophecies, the one who has the right to sit on it. And I was thinking about this, and I thought that really hope is only hope if it's set against a background of what is its opposite, despair. If you don't know what despair is, I'm not sure you can truly understand the meaning of hope. The children of Israel have been, the descendants of Judah, in fact, have been carried off into captivity. I imagine that they were feeling great despair over their situation, angry, questioning, where is God in all of this? The question, I think that's something that we all ask ourselves at times. Where is God in all of this? So as chapter 21 begins, actually in the previous chapter, so last week I ended before the end of chapter 21, and the reason being in the Hebrew Bibles, chapter 21 actually begins at Ezekiel 20, verse 45. And it's where the word of the Lord once again comes to Ezekiel, and he's told in verse 46 of Ezekiel chapter 20, Son of man, set your face towards the southland, preach against the south, and prophesy against the forest land in the Negev. Another translation puts it this way, well, in fact, it's the King James. Son of man, set thy face toward the south, and drop thy word toward the south, and prophesy against the forest of the south field. Now, if you were standing in Babylon, then Judea and Jerusalem are due south, and the Negev is part of the southernmost area of Israel. And interestingly, in that verse, we read the south mentioned 3 times. And each time, there is a different word used for the word for south. The first one denotes Edom. The second one is for the Negev. And the third one is simply a word meaning south. Understanding that the southland and the southern forests of the Negev, and remember that the ancient land of Israel, there were forests in the Negev, not the lush green forests of the north, of course. These were scrub, but they were arid, they were dry, but nevertheless, they had their own trees and scrublands. And we'll see why the difference is important a little bit later. But this helps us as we get into chapter 21, where the Lord has told Ezekiel previously that he's going to kindle a fire in the southernmost forests of Israel. The Lord tells Ezekiel that he is to speak and prophesy against them. The Lord is setting out his case against the people of Israel, particularly its leadership. His goal was clearly stated in the previous chapter in verse 48 of chapter 20, where he said, all flesh will see that I, the Lord, have kindled it, and it shall not be quenched. Interestingly, in that verse I mentioned where there are 3 words for the south, when you enter into chapter 21, and Ezekiel is told to set his face towards Jerusalem and preach against the sanctuaries and prophesy against the land of Israel, there are 3 objects of wrath. As I was reading it, I wonder how Ezekiel felt hearing the words, I am against you. The Jewish people, in theory, were a people who knew the security of having the God of all the earth choose them to be his people, to bring them out of slavery, to bring them through 40 years of wilderness and bring them into the promised land and make his name to dwell in the midst of them. They'd taken that for granted. And now Ezekiel must hear these dreadful words where the Lord says, I am against them. As we look at chapter 21, there is a structure to it. There's the parable and its interpretation, which began in the previous chapter at verse 45, and it continues through to verse 7. And then that's the parable and the interpretation of the fire. Then we have the song of the sword. I find this such a strange description, the song of the sword. And then that's verses 8 to 17. And then there's the oracle of judgment against Jerusalem and her princes in verse 18 to 27. And finally, there's the oracle of judgment against Ammon and against the one who wielded the sword, and that, of course, is Babylon itself. So the judgment that God declares is that his fire will fall upon the righteous, represented by the green trees, and the unrighteous, the dry trees. In other words, all come under the judgment of God. I think the reality is that today, people want to hear sermons about God's love, about his mercy, about his plan for our lives. But sadly, these sermons only make sense if we understand that the foil in which they shine is the wrath of God against sin, the judgment of God on the lost. We're not always comfortable preaching about the wrath of God from our pulpits. Contemporary preaching often asks, what is the main point of the chapter? What is the focus? Instead of providing the bigger picture. But chapter 21 provides the bigger picture. The last verse of the previous chapter, Ezekiel was complaining that he had to keep giving all of these parables. Perhaps he had a sense of what's coming. And the chapter 21 moves from the fire that God is sending to the sword of his judgment. In the first section, the sword is prepared for use against Israel. In the second, it's against Israel's leaders, that's verse 12. And in the third, from verse 18 onwards, the one who yields the sword of God, that is the king of Babylon, will ultimately become its victim. But the real victim, the one that Babylon's king is coming for, is the present king that was sitting in Jerusalem, and that's Zedekiah. If we're thinking about the sword, where is the first time that we see a sword brandished against humanity. It's in the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve are expelled because they've sinned. And in Genesis 3 verse 24, we read this: He drove man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. I'm going to come back to the sword a bit later. But in chapter 21, we also read that God, as he speaks about the sword of his judgment, has the same goal as he stated in chapter 20. All flesh will know that I am the Lord. Judgment is so certain that Ezekiel is asked to perform what's known as a prophetic sign act. Let's read what he's told that he must do in verse 6. As for you, son of man, groan with breaking heart and bitter grief, groan before their eyes. The Hebrew here translated as a breaking heart literally means breaking loins, for the loins were seen as the seat of physical strength, and when they were broken, emotions were shattered. What he's to demonstrate is his grief over what God is going to do. In the totality of God's judgment, we discover that both the righteous and the unrighteous will experience not only the raging fires of God on the land of Israel, which of course begs the question, is God being just? God previously in chapter 18 told them, the soul that sins is a soul that will die. And he gave an invitation that said, turn to me and live. So is this a contradiction? I suppose the resolution to this conflict is that God is saying that when judgment falls upon the land, it will be experienced by all. The unrighteous will indeed die for their sins, but the righteous shall live even though he dies. So poor Ezekiel must demonstrate through his own grief and his own sorrow what is coming, so that when people ask him why he's acting in this way, he will answer, it is because the judgment of God is coming. Of course, in verse 8, the Lord once again comes, and we read that the word of the Lord comes to Ezekiel, and now he must prophesy about the sword that is coming against them, a sword that has been polished and sharpened and ready for judgment. Ezekiel 21 verse 10 describes this sword as sharpened for slaughter, polished to flash like lightning. Or shall we rejoice, you who have despised the rod, my son, with everything of wood? One of the reasons that judgment is coming is because they despised the rod. When I looked this word up, I discovered that the Hebrew here for rod is the same as the word that is elsewhere used for scepter. What God is saying in verse 12, and what Ezekiel is told to do, is to remind them, and I wonder if as he spoke those words, they really got the point. You see, the scepter is the sign of the ruler. A king has a scepter. He extends his scepter in judgment. It is the sign of his kingship. But the scepter here is also the same word, shevet, that's used for the shepherd's rod, the shepherd's crook, as it were. And perhaps this is to remind the children of Israel that the king should rule as a shepherd over his people. And so God says one of the reasons that the sword of judgment is coming is because they despised the rod. They didn't value what God had placed in their hands as the kings of Israel. and Judah. So Ezekiel is told to cry out and wail. It is against my people. It is against the princes of Israel. You see, this was a revelation that it was because the kings of Israel had despised their rule. In other words, they'd ruled for themselves instead of ruling for the King of Kings. Instead of leading their people like a shepherd leads a flock, they'd grown rich, they taxed the poor. And so God had lost patience with the kings of Judah. In verse 13 we read, "It will not be for testing. How could it be if you despise the rod, declares the Lord?" So God is repeating himself. You despised what was given to you. Then Ezekiel is told to mark out a map. And he does so, no doubt, by drawing a map on the ground, showing the route that the army of Babylon will take as it marches upon Jerusalem. We can see what actually happens by looking at 2 Kings. And the verses in 2 Kings will show us Nebuchadnezzar marching to Jerusalem to deal with Zedekiah because Zedekiah had rebelled against him. And we can read 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 19 to 20. And this is Zedekiah. "And he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. And Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And as a result of his rebellion, we discovered the following chapter, in chapter 25, verses 1 to 4. In the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And they built siege works all around it. So the city was besieged until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. So for 2 years, Nebuchadnezzar's army surrounded Jerusalem until on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city, there was no food for the people. Then a breach was made in the city. In the midst of the horror that Ezekiel must have felt, his grief over the end of the monarchy, Ezekiel has a word from the Lord, a word of promise, and a word of hope. Now, I'm sure that the exiles in Egypt who heard him no doubt didn't understand. So often in dark places, we can't see beyond our own suffering. But Ezekiel is challenged by God to look beyond what he is experiencing, to see the heart of God. And God speaks to him. In Ezekiel 21, verse 26, God says, "Thus says the Lord, remove the turban, take off the crown. Things shall not remain as they are." Imagine his grief. The turban here, perhaps the diadem is the priesthood. Take off the crown. This belongs to the monarchy. Both the priesthood and kingship is being removed from Judah. But as we will discover, they will be given to the one to whom judgment truly belongs. And in verse 27 we read, "Ruin, ruin I will make it. This also shall not be until he comes, the one to whom judgment belongs, and I will give it to him." When God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt and brought them into the land of Canaan, his intent was that he should be their king. But the people cried out to Samuel and said they wanted to have a king like the nations around them. Now, through the prophet Samuel, the Lord warns them of the danger and the consequences of human kings. So in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, we read this, because he's going to speak what the Lord gave to him. And he tells the people what will happen when a king rules over them. In chapter 8, verse 17, "He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." I don't think I would have wanted to be Samuel saying that. But they wanted to be like the other nations. They wanted a king to judge them and to go out before them and to fight their battles. So here is God in chapter 21 of Ezekiel saying, "I'm going to remove both the priesthood and the monarchy from the land of Israel." Now, when Jacob blessed his sons and prophesied over them, what did he say to Judah? In Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10, he said, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." And this is why it's worth mentioning that the word for scepter and the word for rod used in chapter 21 is the same word for scepter that's used here. And it's a Hebraic device, so that when you hear the word scepter or the word shevet, you think not only of the shepherd's crook, but you think of the symbol of rulership. And so in Genesis 49, God says through Jacob to his son Judah, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." Ezekiel, who knew his scriptures well, no doubt would have thought about and considered this prophecy. His thoughts would have turned to the messianic king who would one day sit on David's throne and rule forever. Perhaps Psalm 2 even came to mind in verse 6, where the Lord said, "As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill." When we think about how this is fulfilled, our thoughts turn to Mary and the visitation that she has from the angel to tell her that she will bear a child. And she's told that this infant that she's going to carry, well, let's see what the angel says to her. In Luke 1 verse 32, "He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there shall be no end." Back in the land of Babylon, the exiles must surely have understood the purpose of Nebuchadnezzar's army preparing to march south towards Jerusalem. And so these words that Ezekiel is speaking to them about the impending, all-encompassing judgment of God were not words to comfort them. Rather, they were words perhaps to warn future generations. perhaps even us, of the horror of God's judgment upon sin and sinners. And the only reason that we don't face that same judgment is because Jesus bore it in our place. Perhaps a deeper understanding of the wrath and the fury of God against sin is something that should spur us on in sharing the gospel with those who are lost, those who will experience this judgment unless they too come to a saving knowledge of Jesus. Perhaps understanding this will magnify in our own hearts the gift of God's love and mercy towards us in the person of his Son, Jesus.